The British outpost on the Rock of Gibraltar is well known. It was captured by the British in 1704, with the conquest recognized by most of the other great powers in the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. However, that treaty also granted Britain the rights to another Spanish Mediterranean territory, the island of Menorca, today part of the Spanish Crown. Located in the Balearic Islands near the larger Majorca, for the better part of a century, Menorca served as a critical base for the British Royal Navy. At the time of the island's initial capture by the British in 1708, one of the earliest global wars was raging, the War of the Spanish Succession. The great powers were jockeying for strategic territories all over the world. Under the command of General James Stanhope, and with Royal Navy assistance, the British had first taken control of Ciutadella, Menorca's 2 millennia-old capital dating back to Greco-Roman times, and which had been founded by Carthage. The British had then forced the Bourbon Spanish garrison of Mahon, which was also bolstered by French troops, to surrender. At first, the British set up General Stanhope as military governor, leaving the existing Spanish civil administration in charge of day-to-day affairs. However, the British soon came to see the same strategic value in Menorca that many powers had through the centuries. Accordingly, by 1712, they were making moves to hang on to the island permanently. On June 7th, it officially became a British Crown colony, with the Spanish civil administration reorganized and a British governor appointed. Despite this, and somewhat uniquely, the official language of the island remained Catalan, though some place names were anglicized, at least for English speakers. One of these was Mahon, or Port Mahon in English, where the British would set up their administration, and where the British Royal Navy would set up one of their most important Mediterranean bases. Mahon traces its own legacy back to Greco-Roman times, and possibly even earlier, with links to the Phoenicians. A decade later, in 1722, the British would make the change in capital official. The British also inherited the fortress at San Felipe, built nearly 2 centuries earlier by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, outfitting the fort to suit British defense needs. The British did impart a significant amount of cultural influence on the island. Though English was not made the official language, its significant presence led to the development of a unique Creole dialect, with several Menorcan words borrowed from the English language. The British also established an architectural and civic legacy, with public spaces such as roads and squares named after British figures, including, for example, one of the island's most notable governors, General Richard Kane, as well as numerous examples of 18th century British-style architecture, some of which was constructed by local Menorcans imitating the style. The British also built additional fortifications in and around Port Mahon. This included Fort Marlborough, a critical component of the harbor defense. By 1756, however, what became known as the 7 Years' War was underway, another worldwide great power conflict. This meant Britain's enemies again had their eyes on Menorca. In fact, although war was imminent, it had not even been declared yet on April 10th, when a French landing party sailed for Menorca. They arrived on the shores of Menorca 8 days later, quickly taking control of Ciutadella and most of the island, while the British held out in the fort of San Felipe. By April 20th, a siege had set in. On May 8th, initial bombardments began by the French. Admiral John Byng set out from Gibraltar, in command of a British relief force. The force numbered 19 mostly battered ships, including those which had escaped the French on the island. They arrived on May 19th, but were immediately met with a French force of 17 ships. After suffering considerable damage early in the battle, Admiral Byng ordered a retreat to Gibraltar. Now without any hope of relief, the veteran British commander William Blakeney and his 2,800-man garrison at Fort St. Philip knew their days were numbered. As the French began preparations for an assault on the fort's earthworks, Blakeney recognized the hopelessness of the situation and surrendered. By the time of the surrender, war had officially broken out between Britain and France, and the disaster at Menorca immediately became a major scandal in London. Admiral Byng was court-martialed and ultimately executed for the aborted relief attempt. The governor of Gibraltar was accused of not sending the relief force soon enough. He did not face military punishment, but was dismissed from his post. Blakeney, on the other hand, who had been holding out for 2 months without supplies in charge of the garrison, was portrayed by the press as a hero, and his actions were not called into question. The French took over Menorca and set up a civil administration. However, the British were not giving up so easily. Sir Edward Hawke embarked with another relief force, but when he arrived, realized he did not have enough troops to mount any sort of siege, instead diverting and going to patrol the French coast. This drew a similarly angry response from London, though while Hawke's lack of action was condemned, he was not executed. The French were now in control of the island, and under the new governor, de Lannion, Menorca's wine industry, which had grown notably under the British, saw a major expansion. The winemaking business continues to have a prominent presence on the island today. The 7 Years' War, though, would end with France on the losing side. In the subsequent Treaty of Paris, alongside large concessions in the Americas, France ceded Menorca back to the British. The British would resume expanding the island's fortifications. Less than 2 decades later, they would be put to the test once again. With the Spanish and British now at war, Spain spent the better part of 2 years engaging in a protracted campaign to recapture Gibraltar. Although the British presence there proved to be intractable, the Spanish were not to be deterred. They began to shift their attention toward the other Mediterranean outposts Spain had lost to the British. Throughout the summer of 1781, a Spanish fleet suddenly made their way toward the Balearic Islands. They were discreetly joined by a French contingent as well. On August 19th, the invasion force came within sight of Menorca. As the landing force disembarked, the British garrison, just as in the previous siege against the French, retreated to their fortifications. A lengthy siege would set in. As the British continued to hold out into the fall at Fort St. Philip, the Spanish would increase their force to over 10,000 strong. They had been greeted warmly on most of the island, though the Spanish did expel the Moorish, Jewish, and Greek inhabitants who, under British rule, had immigrated to the island and become a large part of its business community. The Spanish bombarded the fort and sporadically skirmished with the British garrison for months. They stepped up their artillery attacks by introducing mortar fire on November 11th. Given their previous experience, the British were prepared to hold out in Fort St. Philip for much longer than the previous siege. They had a year's worth of supplies and many additional fortifications. This was especially necessary with the main attention of the British being focused on breaking the siege of Gibraltar. Eventually, however, by early the next year, supplies were running low and disease was breaking out. The surrender was signed on February 6th, but was done so on relatively cordial terms. The British garrison would be allowed to leave with dignity. They were permitted to exit with arms in full parade formation. They marched into town where they finally laid down their arms. Reportedly, many of the victorious French and Spanish troops were overcome with emotion at both their victory and the gallantry on both sides. British Commander General James Murray, however, marched with his gaze locked forward and his lips pursed. Murray was court-martialed for the defeat, but he was not punished, with King George III even forcing Murray's accuser to apologize and granting him a promotion. The Spanish crown spent the next years establishing their administration on the island, but the great powers were on the verge of engaging in another, even more destructive series of worldwide conflicts. By 1798, the wars of the French Revolution were underway. As we've taken a look at, Napoleon was campaigning elsewhere in the Mediterranean, in Malta, Egypt, and the Levant. The British, accordingly, wanted to secure their position in the Western Mediterranean, in Gibraltar. Thus, it quickly became a British priority to recapture Menorca, especially with Spain being largely aligned to the French. The expeditionary force arrived off the island on November 7th. The British established a beachhead that same day, overrunning and then holding a Spanish artillery position. 2 days later, they captured the fort and therefore control of the harbor, allowing the remaining majority of the force to land. With the full expeditionary force now on the island, under the command of Sir Charles Stuart, the town surrendered, with many others quickly following suit. Eventually, the Spanish were holed up in Ciutadella. On November 11th, the Spanish Navy desperately attempted a counterattack. They were successfully driven off under the command of Admiral John Thomas Duckworth. On the 14th, Stuart began bombarding Ciutadella. 2 days later, the Spanish garrison surrendered. The British took control of the island and were now able to reactivate their old naval base in Port Mahon. Stuart became the island's military governor, though he resigned 2 years later and would pass away a year after his return to Britain. The new commander was General Henry Edward Fox. He oversaw the construction of even more fortifications on the island. These included the Tower of Es Castell and others. This time, however, it was diplomacy that would determine the island's fate. The Treaty of Amiens was signed in October 1801, ending the War of the Second Coalition. While many of the treaty's provisions were not honored, and in spite of Admiral Nelson's campaigning in the House of Lords to keep the island, the British did cede Menorca back to Spain, peacefully handing it over on March 27, 1802. Although great power warfare would soon break out again, Menorca did not change hands on any further occasions during the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. The island has since remained under Spanish administration to the present day. The legacy of a century of on and off British rule is still visible, from architecture to place and road names to the old British infrastructure and fortifications, which have themselves now become tourist attractions. A significant portion of Menorca's extensive tourism industry does in fact consist of visitors from the British Isles. Though Menorca is now coveted for its beauty rather than its strategic location, this idyllic outpost remains one of the treasures of the Mediterranean. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit the like button and leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel for more content like this and hit the bell button so you don't miss the next video. Be sure to check out the project that forms the basis for these videos at apoliticalworldmap.org. And if you can, please sign up for our Patreon to keep the videos coming. Thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.